Hi, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to share. Um, I will be talking a little bit from multiple past projects, thinking about different types of climate and extreme weather data that we use and how that affects the answers we get. And I think this is an especially important time to be thinking about this because the number of different places where you can get information about climate risk is exploding. And this is largely due to demand from the private sector for asset level risk assessments on a variety of different hazards. But there's now enough that there can even be a ranking of climate risk data providers. And so I think we as researchers need to be really thoughtful about what data we use. There was one assessment externally about different data providers and consistency between them that I think was really telling. This was the Urban Land Institute that asked for information about a certain set of assets from 3 different climate risk data providers. And this was the variation in the answers they got. And so you can see very clearly that these vendors do not agree on asset level risk, ranging from low to very high, none to medium. And there was a lot of reported difficulty in understanding why those risk scores may vary and where that's coming from. So I think we really need to do a better job ourselves of asking questions about what data we're using and why. Okay, so today I will very quickly define some key terms and then move into 2 examples, one from California and one on flooding in North Carolina, where I am now. So there's lots of people use these terms in lots of different ways. So this is by no means the only definition that's out there, but I will be drawing definitions from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is one of their sort of core conceptual figures, linking terms like hazards, exposure, risk, vulnerability all together. So when I say hazard, what I mean is the potential occurrence of a physical event. So this is typically measured as annual probability of a certain event occurring in a certain place. And many people do not know their hazard, right? So many people don't know the percentage likelihood that their house will have a fire or a flood in the next year. Risk, which is the combination of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, is very, in simple terms, the potential for negative consequences, often expressed as something like expected annual loss. So often in monetary terms or similar. Many people also do not know their risk, right? Because day to day, your risk doesn't really affect you very much, except for maybe through your insurance costs. And so I do not know my personal flood risk for my household, and many people would be in similar positions. Impacts, and that's where when I use the term experience, I mean that we are experiencing impacts. And that's what happens when risk materializes, right? So there's this potential for negative consequences, and when those negative consequences materialize, those are the impacts. And unlike hazards and risk, everyone knows what impacts they've experienced, right? You can tell me if your house has flooded in the past. You can tell me how many times you've had to evacuate from a fire and that kind of thing. So there are very meaningful differences from a personal perspective on hazard versus impacts or experience in this way. So when I say hazard and experience in the next couple of sections, that's what I mean. Okay, so talking first about an example from California. This was work I did a couple of years ago, comparing data in California's fire hazard severity zones to actual fire experience. So the state of California releases these severity zones for the whole state. Sometimes they might be in areas the state is responsible for, or in the case of a city or county of Los Angeles, areas that the local government is responsible for. And they designate areas as either it's not a hazard severity zone, or it's moderate, high, or very high. For experience and damage, we take actual burn perimeters. And so Cal Fire carries a database. This goes back quite far. This is just the data from 2020 of every fire that they record. And once you zoom in on each of these little gray flames, there's a burn perimeter associated with it. So what we did for each of these data sets is we took a database on the locations of residential properties. So for example, a lot of this burned area here is not residential use, land use, right? It's vacant. So we took a database on residential properties, looked at both this data set and this one, and said, okay, for the residential properties, what hazard zone are they in? Aggregated that to the tract level, and then how many fire perimeters have they been in? And did the same thing, aggregating up to a tract level. So when you just make maps of the difference by census tract, even just looking at the maps, you can see a really big difference between these different metrics. So when we look at hazard, or the share of residential parcels in the moderate, high, or very high fire hazard severity zone, this is what you see. You see, like, in particular, you see a lot of hazard on the eastern side of the state, as well as the northern coast. And of course, in Southern California, where you might expect. And then B, this middle column, is the number of fires affecting at least one residential parcel in that tract from 1990 to 2019. And then in green is our measure of damage. So the maximum number of residential parcels within a single fire perimeter from that time period. So has there been a really awful fire in these places? How often are they seeing fires? And then what is their hazard category? And first, for both damage and experience, the eastern half of the state here looks really quite different and much more heterogeneous than in the hazard measure. And then they're actually quite low up here on the northern coast in both experience and damage, despite being high hazard. So once we did this, we then took the tracts and looked at some of their demographic and socioeconomic characteristics to see if we would see different patterns depending on which of these three metrics we used. And the answer is some of the time, yes. So first, high hazard tracts are wealthier, but high experience tracts are poorer than their corresponding no hazard or no experience tracts. So here they're organized with tract median income on the x-axis, and then the hazard groupings are on the left, the experience groupings are in the middle, the damage groupings are on the right. And you can see in the hazard grouping, there's the black lines here are the median. There's this kind of slight shift to the right as you go down from none to high. In experience, it actually starts the same way, but then shifts back to the left. So your highest experience set of tracts actually is the lowest median income. And in none, in damage, we revert sort of to what the hazard grouping looks like. It's a little bit hard to see with the tract level median incomes, and actually easier, I think, if you look at the property values in the tract. These are residential assessed property values, where you see this trend going from none and kind of steadily higher for the hazard, but then really the opposite with high. And the tail that you can see with this high experience group, the tail kind of really disappears compared to the tail here, and also in the damage grouping. So clearly, whether you think, if you want to say something like tracts at high risk of fire, neighborhoods at high risk of fire are wealthier or poorer than those that are at no risk, it really depends which metric you choose here in terms of what answer you're going to get. On the other hand, when we look at racial composition, we see pretty steady patterns across all three of our groups. So this is the percent white in the tract. And this, we think, is largely because a lot of the more racially diverse tracts, so the ones on this side of the x-axis, are in very urbanized areas where they're very likely to have low hazard, low experience, and low damage. And that kind of doesn't shift in the same way from low to high as you see with the property values and income measures. Okay, so that was my example from California, where how we measure this matters. I'll now talk about flooding in North Carolina, and here I'll be talking about work led by my doctoral student, Helena Garcia, who has done a really phenomenal job with this project and has made all the wonderful graphics that you will see in the following slides. So for flood hazard, we use FEMA's floodplain maps. These are the digital flood insurance rate maps, and they delineate three main zones. What you'll hear of as the 100-year floodplain is the area with a greater than 1% chance of flooding in any given year. There's an orange fringe here, and that's what people call the 500-year floodplain. So it's an area with a 0.2 to 1% chance of flooding in any given year. And then if you have less than a 0.2% chance, you are considered at minimal flood hazard. So that's what we use for our measure of flood hazard. Unlike for fires, there are no comprehensive data sets out there on flood footprints. So Helena created one, and she did this using address level data on flood insurance claims that I'll show in a second. But she mapped flood extents for 78 flood events across the state of North Carolina over the course of 25 years. We had 78 events. By comparison, there were only 18 of those were presidential disaster declarations. So we're looking at events that get much smaller than that. And if you compare to events that actually have flood footprints, like spatial information that you could use about exposure, only 6 of those events had any sort of high resolution spatial information before. So this is a huge leap forward in terms of what we can say about flood experience. So for what we did for each of the 78 events is we took address scale flood insurance program information. And for each event, we looked at whether a policy claimed or did not claim. So if they claimed, we considered that flood presence. Those are the blue points. And if they did not, that would be flood absence. Those are the green points. We then used a lot of geospatial data related to the likelihood of flooding to train 78, one model for each event, random forest models to be able to use these variables to predict flood presence or flood absence. We did this 78 times. What you get for a single event is a map of flood probability. So the darker blue and purple areas are places with a higher probability of flooding. And then we choose a threshold and convert that to either you flooded or you didn't. Although you don't have to, actually. But we did, in this case, convert to you flooded or you didn't. And what you can see in this box in the bottom left is how we did in our model predictions. And so of the 13,195 people who claimed, our model predicts that 11,500 of them claimed. So we're doing quite well there. And if you look at flood absence, where we have 100,000 places where there were policies but no claim, we have 99,500 of them not flooding. So you can see our accuracy is quite good. These are a bunch of different accuracy metrics you can use to evaluate this model. Across all events, all 78 events, the average area under the curve, which is one of these evaluation metrics, is 0.76. So this is a pretty solid performance, and we tend to do better for the big events than for the smaller events. So what you can do with all those 78 flood footprints is you can track flooding at the building scale over time. So what you see here is a time series of event by event, year by year, buildings flooding. The little black dots are when the buildings flood for the first time. And then if they flood for a second, third, or fourth time, that's showing up as a yellow or red circle. And if you look at where flood experience has actually occurred in the state, we have over 90,000 buildings that have flooded at least once and 20,000 buildings flooding at least twice. How well does that compare to our FEMA floodplain flood hazard maps? Oh, come back. There we go. Well, 43% of all flooded buildings are outside the 100-year floodplain. So they're capturing a little more than half of the flood experience if you look at it on a per building metric. But when you divide it between our repetitively flooded buildings versus the once flooded buildings, you see a really significant difference. So only 17% of the repetitively flooded ones are outside the FEMA floodplains, meaning the vast majority of the places flooding a lot are in the hazard maps. And that makes sense, right? Because hazard is trying to pick up an annual probability. It's trying to capture the places that are most likely to flood and therefore the most likely to flood multiple times over a 30-year time period. The once flooded buildings, half of them are in and half of them are out. And that also, given that we have lots of events that are rarer than 1 in 100-year events, we have really extreme events that occur and flood places that are, of course, outside the 100-year floodplain. This also isn't terribly surprising. So I think I am just running out of time now. So to sum up quickly, hazard, risk, and experience are totally different from the perspective of individuals and households, right? Like I don't really experience a hazard in the way that I experience a flood. If you actually trace those kind of down the line, you can see differences in the neighborhood characteristics and the household characteristics of people based on hazard versus experience. And in North Carolina, what we see is that flood experience generally extends well beyond those designated hazard areas, but repetitive flooding, which is really what the hazard zones are more designed to capture, is actually relatively well captured by those high hazard zones. So I think, again, the point here is to encourage us to be really critical about the data we're using and think about how that relates to the individual and household outcomes that we're trying to link to. And I'll stop there.
Great. That was terrific. Right on time. And we've got a few minutes for some questions. So if you're in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, maybe the best thing is, if we don't share screen, and you guys should be able to unmute yourselves and ask your question. And I'm happy to start with one. Miyuki, if you think about the places that flood that FEMA does not capture, to what extent do you think that is idiosyncratic events that would cause that place to flood at any point in time versus changes in the ways that roads have been built or properties have been built? Sort of risk is really sort of changing underneath this place. It's now riskier than it used to be.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think it depends on the map. So for example, when I have friends buying houses in different places that send me an address and ask me if they should buy flood insurance or if they shouldn't buy the house, what I will often do is I'll start with the FEMA floodplain map, but I'll look at how old it is. Because the age of that map influences not just the accuracy of the inputs, but also the modeling sophistication and the event history that they have, right? So I think there are situations, North Carolina is really not one of them. There are situations where the flood maps are so old and the development, the changes in the topography and the land use have really outpaced Harris County being one example, where I would say a lot of the damage outside the floodplain there is probably of age of the flood map. And some of it is shortcomings of the models as well, though that's changing. Whereas other places, like I said, North Carolina, the mapping is actually not that old, and land use is changing, but not as dramatically in most of the state as in some other areas. That the outside of the floodplain flooding for those events, I think, are largely because they exceed the design storm, right? They're more rain than we expected. They're more surge than we expected. And so that's just, or I shouldn't say expected. There are more rain and more surge than what was mapped as the 100-year, the 1% event. So I think it probably depends on where.
Got it. Thank you. Lori.
Thank you for this. It's super interesting. I have a question on the California one. So the finding that those tracts that actually had an experience versus a risk or hazard being lower income. So I'm wondering why. So I want to see the spatial distribution of the of that connection. So is there something about these lower income risky areas that makes them more risky than the higher income risky areas? You see what I mean? And
Yeah,
if
yeah, yeah,
you don't,
totally.
how could we get there in terms of analytically?
So I actually think some progress has been made on this recently. And I think it was Judd Boomhauer at UC San Diego who did some of this work looking at actually our firefighting patterns and expenditures. Because with fire exposure, with fire extents especially, we are making an active choice when to let them burn and when to stop them. And so some of the difference could be coming from rural high hazard areas versus, where the fire could encompass a few houses, but they're so remote that you would stop it before it got to many more, versus like the suburban, wealthier, wildland urban interface areas, where if that fire got close, it would eat up a lot of houses quickly. And so the fire gets stopped before it reaches any house. So I think there are differences in that aspect of like human decision making and control. I'm sure there are others and some of the geographic patterns are relevant, but I think he found that there were differences in our firefighting choices as well.
That is, I mean, it's just fascinating, right? And huge equity implications as well, just different public investments and zoning and all of that sort of stuff. So thank you. Super interesting.
Renee, you've got a question.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. I was really interested in kind of, you were talking about the recency and how up to date the maps were, but I'm also wondering whether or not we're trending in the right direction with when it comes to like mapping and stuff and land use planning as well, right? Like over time, do you actually see in North Carolina, but also maybe more broadly based on not based on like broader knowledge, whether or not over time there's been more plots or parcels that are flooded that are outside of the uh, flood map zones versus like maybe in the past, or are we trending the right way or not, I guess, and how does that impact insurance and financial ruin for people?
That's a great question, and one that I have long been interested in that would require an undergraduate army of researchers digitizing historical floodplain maps so that we could actually track all of this over time. I'm still considering it, but I haven't pulled the trigger on doing it. Um, so I think it's hard to say for a couple of reasons. Um, Impacts and where the water actually goes is very stochastic, right? So the fact that the maps perform poorly, like it kind of drives me crazy when people are like, this place flooded and only 35% of the houses were in a floodplain. It's like,
Mm.
that's totally reasonable if it was the amount of precipitation and storm surge was triple what was assumed to be the 1% annual event, right? So I think it's hard to, do in kind of event-based ways. If we could look over really, really long time periods, kind of as Helena's work has started to pave the path towards, then we could see that. I will say, because these maps have insurance implications, there's also a lot of interest in not making them too big, making the zones too big. And you do see in the iterations of flood map changes, even recently, the hazard zones getting smaller, not bigger. And that can be sometimes that's because we got more accurate elevation data. And so actually, when you look at it and you model that same event, like it doesn't flood. It can also be because of the time series of storms that you use to model what the 1% annual event would look like. So it wouldn't surprise me, I guess, if like you're seeing more flooding outside of the 100-year floodplain, over time. And I don't necessarily think that's because the mapping process and the modeling is fundamentally flawed. I think it might just be the climate is changing faster than any of our design like processes are. And we, whether you like it or not, there's consequences to the zones being too big in addition to the zones being too small. So, like, the easiest thing for them to do would make the zones huge, and then any place that flooded would be in the floodplain, right? But they're not going to do that. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, and I would love to look into it empirically. But I guess what I'm saying is it wouldn't surprise me if the share was not getting smaller over time, but that wasn't really like a true flaw of the mapping process. I do think there are flaws in the mapping process, but I don't necessarily think it's that.
Okay, great. So let's have one more question from Nikhil Kothakal.
All right, I'll try to be quick.
Very good.
Thanks, Miyuki. And Lou, right before I joined this call, I was on a call with some people about what flooding indicator to use for this NC data portal, which is evidently used for community health assessment planning. And right now it's a 100-year floodplain. And I was like, I don't know if that's protective enough. And just hearing that that might be a better representative of, yeah, recurrent flooding. So I was curious, like, do you have an opinion on for like planning, maybe more for health purposes, not private, but like local governments? Or is it better for us to rely on something like a 100-year floodplain rather than nothing? Or like, I'm like, should I suggest that maybe we shouldn't use this at all? Because like maybe people are making plans that are, not as informed, you know what I mean? Like,
Um,
your
so
opinion.
I always recommend the 100-year floodplain as a starting point, but not the ending point. So I think no matter what, there is valuable information in there, right? Like the places in there are not going to actually be at magically low hazard, right? They are high hazard areas for sure. At the local level, often the government has access to information on where flood damage has occurred historically. And that would probably be so talking about like what I do when my friends ask if the house is going to flood. If there's an event of record in that area, right? So for a lot of North Carolina, it would be Florence or Helene, right? Where it kind of what we have thought of as an unprecedented level of flooding. And if there's local information on what flooded during that event, then like that would be the two data sources together would be like information that I would feel comfortable using to think about not just like the highest hazard areas, but also what's possible. Because it's certainly possible that we will see another Florence, see another Helene, right? And then I think it also resonates a little bit more with people making local decisions because that's what they've lived, right? So it also is easier for them to use that in decision making.
Great, thanks. One question coming up in the chat. So following up on Nikhil's question, I'd like to point out that the 100-year floodplain identifies the areas that have a greater than 1% chance of flooding. It's easy to mistakenly assume the probability of flooding at those properties is exactly 1%. Good point.
Yes, many of them have flooded much more than once in 100 years.
Okay, awesome. Well, we are perfectly on time, so let's move now to Ethan Raker from the University of British Columbia, who's going to be talking about air pollution and health, patterns of perception and response.
Okay, can you guys see my screen? I think those or the icons on the left will go away in a sec.
Looks good.
Okay. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Let me start my timer so I stay on time. And thanks to Elizabeth for the invitation to join you. Today, I'm moving us from California and North Carolina on fires and floods to Houston on air pollution. So I'm presenting findings from joint work with Robert Bozick on patterns of perception and response to air pollution and health. So the core idea that I'm going to talk about today is answering a set of descriptive questions. How are people's perceptions of air pollution as a health risk, and what they do about it patterned across people socially, and are these processes dynamic over time? So air pollution is a leading global health risk, not news to anyone in the room or in the Zoom. Exposure to poor air quality causes a variety of health morbidities, including respiratory complications, which are proximate causes of mortality. In 2023, the Global Burden of Disease study ranked particulate matter pollution as the second leading contributor to disease burden mortality. So understanding perceptions of air pollution as it relates to a health risk is a critical starting point to promoting healthy behavior changes and promoting broader support for environmental policies to reduce pollution. So in other words, or in line with the health belief model in psychology, for people to protect themselves and for environmental policies to gain traction, we might argue, air pollution must be understood by the public as a health threat, not just a broad environmental issue. But despite considerable public opinion research that studies environmental attitudes, the vast majority of this research tracks general environmental and climate concerns. For only a small subset of studies, at least in our review, were researchers measuring underlying reasons for environmental perceptions, like concern for property values, or concern for climate change, or concern for health. And very few have attempted to understand how these health concerns and health vulnerabilities translate into reported mitigation behaviors like using an air purifier in your home. And additionally, among studies looking at sociodemographic correlates of concern and attitudes, very few track group differences over time. So in sum, Robert and I are arguing that narrowing in on health-specific concerns for air pollution is important in public opinion research for public health and policy reasons, but we have an underdeveloped understanding of who, in terms of sociodemographics like age and race, expresses this type of concern, how those may change over time, and how these processes are implicated in mitigation behaviors. So this leads us to ask two questions, which we think address important gaps in the literature on health, pollution, and public attitudes. The first is, how do sociodemographic group differences in health concern about air pollution change over time? Specifically, we're interested in those along sex or gender, race, political party, and age. And then second, how do respiratory conditions, a key indicator of health vulnerability to air pollution, shape both health concern and taking mitigation actions? To address these research questions, we use data from the Kinder Houston Area Survey from 2000 to 2022, which is a repeated cross-sectional survey representative of Houston area adults. We collect data across 11 survey years beginning in 2000. To the best of our knowledge, this is the only source of data that provides information on health-specific concern for air pollution over more than a few years. Moreover, we think that Houston and Harris County is a particularly useful context in which to conduct this research. First, Houston is one of the most diverse cities in the United States in terms of race and partisanship, which gives us ample sample sizes to estimate demographic subgroup attitudes. And then second, Houston remains one of the most polluted cities in the United States. So while it's experienced overall improvements in air pollution, particularly in terms of ozone since the turn of the millennia, since still in 2022, the American Lung Association ranked Houston as the 8th worst city and the worst large city in the country for year-round average levels of particulate pollution. This is a problem across areas of Harris County, especially in Houston's Ship Channel, and the many communities that surround the high polluting industries like concrete processing and metal recycling, which are particularly bad for NO2. So importantly, in 2022, Robert and I included a special module in the survey that asked respondents about current or past experiences with 5 respiratory conditions, specifically asthma, COPD, allergies, bronchitis, and long COVID. And we include a series of questions that, in addition to health concern for air pollution, asked around mitigation actions, which I'll outline on this next slide. So our 2 key outcome variables from the survey I'm going to focus on today are a single question on health concern, which asks respondents, how concerned are you about the effects of air pollution on your family's health? We focus on distinguishing those who are very concerned from those who are somewhat or not at all concerned. And the second set of outcomes are four mitigation actions asked just in 2022, which include the frequency that respondents avoided busy roads, avoided polluted areas, spent more time indoors, or used an air purifier at home, with response options ranging from always to never. To give you a sense of what our sample looks like across all waves, we have information on around 15,000 adults living in Harris County and the city of Houston. The 2022 survey includes around 2,000 of those respondents. Descriptive statistics for the independent variables are shown here. Unweighted, the average age was 42. Women comprised around 53 of the sample, and the sample mirroring the city population is extremely diverse in terms of race and political party. In 2022, respiratory conditions were common. Approximately 40% of adults reported one, and 14% of adults reported two or more of those five respiratory conditions. Additional information on the control variables that we gathered are noted at the bottom, although I'm not displaying their descriptive statistics here. Descriptively, over the past 20 years, health concern for air pollution has declined in Houston. In 2000, 58% of Houston adults were very concerned about the effects of air pollution for their family's health. This dropped relatively steadily over the next 19 years. In 2022, we observed a quite precipitous drop down to only 17% of Houston adults report being very concerned. Note that this quite large drop in the last survey year is driven more by changes in the share of adults expressing being somewhat concerned, with a relatively more stable share in the population who are not at all concerned, at least in aggregate. Here I'm showing you simple regression coefficients and standard errors from two linear probability models, predicting, again, the probability of being very concerned for air pollution and your family's health. So the models include a variety of controls listed below, zip code, and year fixed effects. So we're thinking about these as the average adjusted associations, conditional on these other observable characteristics, and temporal and spatial variation. On average, women are 9 percentage points more likely than men to report being very concerned, compared to whites, Black, Hispanic, and Asians are all more likely to express concern, with Black Houstonians being 16 percentage points more likely than their white counterparts. Democrats and independents are also more likely than the Republican neighbors to express being very concerned for air pollution and their family's health. The second column restricts to just the 2022 survey and adds our measure of the number of respiratory health conditions. Here, we find that those with two or more health conditions are 12 percentage points more likely to be very concerned than those who report no respiratory health conditions. These results align strikingly with prior studies, or perhaps not strikingly, expectedly, with prior studies on general environmental attitudes. Women, people of color, and more liberal people are more likely to express concern, which leads us to our next question. Are these average differences in health concern for air pollution, which are aggregated across all years, static over time? Here, I'm showing you results from a set of similar linear probability models on the full sample that interacts an indicator for survey year with each group. We then recover estimates for each age, race, gender, and party subgroup and hold all other variables and controls at their means. So panel A in the top left, we show very modest and insignificant differences in changes in health concern between the average 30-year-old in red and the average 70-year-old in teal living in Houston. In only 2015 were older Houstonians more likely than younger Houstonians to express being very concerned for air pollution and health. In panel B in the top right, we're examining racial differences. While the decline in concern over time for white people in red was largely stable, a decline in concern among Black adults indicated in green from 2000 to 2015 reversed and peaked in 2017 and 2019. During the early 2000s, Hispanic concern for air pollution in blue was comparable to that of white Houstonians, but in the mid to late 2000s, specifically 2005 to 2011, the probabilities of health concern among Hispanics mirrored more closely those of Blacks. More recently, however, racial differences in health concern are better characterized as sort of like a three-part stratification, with Hispanics' health concerns situated between the low levels of white concern and higher levels of Black residents in their concern. Panel C in the bottom left, we observe a convergence over time in gender differences in concern. From 2000 to 2007, women were significantly more likely to be very concerned for air pollution and health. But since 2000, that gap has actually closed, such that in more recent survey waves, there are no significant differences comparing men and women in their health concerns for air pollution. Finally, panel D, we show the temporal dynamics across political party affiliation. There were two distinct periods of changing trends. First, there was a decline in concern among Republicans in the 2000s that widened the party-based concern gap between Republicans versus Democrat and independents. This was followed by a second period of widening gaps from 2015 to 2019. So during this period, the party gap in health concern was driven by both a reduction in concern among Republicans and more growing concern among Democrats. So the evidence shows that health concerns about pollution is not only socially differentiated across race, gender, and political party, but it's also quite dynamic. And although we do not directly test a linkage between politics and health concern, we note that changes in race and party gaps tend to coincide with national politics, including the 2008 election of President Obama and the first Trump presidency in 2016 to 2020. Finally, we examine the relationship between the number of respiratory health conditions and the frequency of taking these mitigation actions. Here I'm showing you coefficients and standard errors on our primary independent variable. I've included all the controls which are listed at the bottom. We find that people with two or more respiratory health conditions report significantly higher frequency of taking all four mitigation actions: avoiding busy roads, avoiding polluted city areas, spending more time indoors, and using an air purifier in their home. This leads us to conclude that health vulnerability correlates both with health concern, which we showed before, but also predicts action. I'll note here in parentheses that a supplement that we did that examines each of those 5 conditions separately instead of the number of conditions, we find that COPD drives many of these observed associations. So in conclusion, health concerns about air pollution in one of the United States' most polluted cities have declined over 2 decades. And while age differences are relatively stable and insignificant, differences across sex, political party, and race are dynamic. We argue that with this descriptive baseline understanding, future research is needed with more sophisticated tools to examine what predicts people's change in concern. We believe our results suggest one potential promising avenue, which is along the lines of national political cycles. And importantly, this is derived from our observation that these are not smooth trends. We notice considerable year-to-year fluctuations, which suggests this type of volatility points to the fact that attitudes and concerns are sensitive to short-term events, potentially, and not necessarily long-run changes in air quality, for example. Finally, we also find that health vulnerability is important for both understanding public concern, but also for taking mitigation actions, which leads us to conclude that environmental health risk is not only about exposure, but it's about people's perceptions and responses. Thank you so much. I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Ethan. That was great. Terrific. So let me open it up to the audience, other participants for questions. Okay, well, I will start with one. So, do you know, and you probably said this, but do you know what was happening with exposure, sort of actual pollution over this time period, and also kind of media attention to pollution issues in Houston?
Yeah. So I for the sake of time, selected just two of the three parts of the paper. The
Okay.
part that was excluded was our analysis that examined zip code level exposure to three types of pollutants: ozone, NO2, and PM 2.5. Um, if I was more prepared, I would have supplemental slides to show you at this
That's
time.
okay.
And essentially, we observed decline in average exposure to all three of those pollutants
Okay.
using the zip code averages, which were published in, I think, a Nature paper that we gathered publicly available data. And of those three pollutants, PM 2.5, higher levels of zip code exposure amongst our respondents based on their zip code of residence predicts greater concern, but not for NO2 and ozone. And so there were declines over time, but certainly lots of zip codes in the city that experienced relatively little changes from 2000. That analysis is 2000 to 2016.
Okay.
Media attention is fascinating because that's one of the kind of short-term factors that we think is driving this volatility, particularly for race and political party differences over time. Um, I'm not super familiar with um, how that was working, especially in like local politics with mayoral candidates. Um, and that's something that I think we should look into if we really want to disentangle. Is it like the national political landscape, which we nodded to in the paper, or more local factors that are fluctuating year to year?
Great. Thanks. Lori and then Yunyoung.
Thanks, Ethan. This is super interesting. Elizabeth asked one of my questions, but I could tell you had zip codes. So I'm really glad that you brought that data in. Um, my question is about some of the temporal patterns and if you've looked into those as a way to sort of make some progress on the bullet points on your last slide. So it was interesting the way 2015 was a big jump in the age difference with
Mhm.
older adults. I mean, anything there that might give some insight as to why, because that would help policy targets. Same
Yeah.
thing, like you've got, right, genders converging over time. What do you
Mhm.
think that's all about? So just that extra layer of interpretation is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. Um, my general sense, I'll take the second question around like the convergence in gender over time. Um, a relative strength of this paper and a comparative advantage is, as I argued, the fact that we have this specific health concern question asked over time, which is not frequent in other studies. With that comparative advantage comes a disadvantage, which is this is just a single item, question item. It's not a set of questions that we can derive like a latent construct, which we're trying to get at, which is people's health concern. My hypothesis on the gender convergence over time is, although this question is single question is asked like distinctly, it also comes in a survey where we're asking people lots of questions around their attitudes about like environmental factors, which are like not randomly ordered. And so my sense is that there might be a way in which like there's some not survey response bias going on, but um, people are responding to a set of questions. How concerned are you about pollution for property values? How concerned are you about pollution for climate change? And that people are subconsciously like changing their responses to like the next question based on how concerned they are about others. So like as concern for pollution for climate change has increased over this time, people may be like, oh, that's the dominant reason I should be concerned. And, you know, none of my kids have been diagnosed with asthma, so maybe I'm not as concerned. And so that's what I think some of what's happening. That doesn't necessarily explain like the gender
Right.
convergence, but
Yeah, would men and women do that differently, right?
I,
I
I,
don't
I,
know.
No,
Yeah.
that's not my hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's more that I think people over time are assessing this response or assessing this question vis-a-vis other questions on the survey. The gender convergence has been shown in other studies on general environmental attitudes, as women are expressing more concern for other aspects of the environment compared to men. And then the age, I'm not so sure how much to make of the 2015 jump, if that's something we should hang our hat too much on, that 1 year of being significantly different from younger Houstonians, given the 10 out of the 11 were not significant. That could just be a um, random variation. I'll have to look into the gender convergence literature more. Thanks.
Great.
And just for fun, I'd look at 2015. I mean,
Yeah.
it really did buck the trend.
Hmm.
Young, did you have a question?
Yeah, but my question align with Lori's question, and my question is around the racial differences and your potential hypotheses. But then I'll save it later for the discussion. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. So let's turn to our third presentation, which is Jennifer Alshire of the University of Southern California, and she is going to talk about extreme temperatures and multi-system biological aging.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit here to focus mostly on health and because I work on the Center for Biodemography and Population Health, going to be focusing on biological differences in health. So this is work that I do with Eun-Young Che, who's a postdoc here on the call and affiliated with our center. So, with apologies to those of you who are still in cold locales, Lori looks like she's a little chilly right now. I'm going to be talking about extreme heat, which is an upcoming problem that we're now facing every year. So these extreme heat events that you can see, the spatial distribution mapped here on the right, are growing in their frequency, in their duration, in their intensity. And they really constitute a major health risk to populations. And we've seen this over time, most dramatically and traumatically from deaths of particularly older adults preceding heat waves that have been happening in the United States and other places around the country. And we focus on older adults because as we age, we undergo specific physiological changes that make us especially vulnerable to heat impacts, children being the other vulnerable group. Most of the research that's focused on population health impacts of heat-related exposures is focusing on these acute clinical outcomes. So things like mortality, as I said, but also hospitalization from cardiovascular or respiratory events. But we think that there's likely a subclinical component here that even if we don't get really sick and we don't go to the hospital and there's no death involved, we're still being impacted by these heat shocks. But at the moment, we don't really have a lot of population-based evidence for how that extreme heat experience might alter our physiology or biology. I do list one paper here, which is also in the QR code up in the top right-hand part of the screen, where Eun-Young and I worked on examining this using epigenetic clocks that tell us about accelerated and decelerated aging, and that was published, I think, 12 months ago. But for today's presentation, we're moving away from epigenetic clocks and into blood-based clinical biomarkers. For this, we're using data from the Health and Retirement Study, the 2016 sub-study that included a venous blood collection. We're also only looking at 7-day heat exposure in this particular presentation. We look at other timescales, but for time's sake, I'm not going to get into that today. And you can see the different systems we're going to be looking at. So one of my, I think looking at these age acceleration measures, these kind of global measures of health is really helpful for understanding what that basic weather or environmental exposure to health connection is, but they're kind of non-specific. So we're going to really be focusing on different systems that we can pick up with from our blood-based biomarkers. In today's talk, I'm going to focus on just really the results from one type of exposure, which is exposure to a heat index above 90, which we think of as kind of moderate heat stress. There's also a much higher intensity exposure that we think probably comes with more physiological load, but I'm not going to focus on that especially. I'm not going to describe the measures either, but if you want to know more about the data, the website for the specific data that we use for weather data is here. This is a public data resource that we developed through the Biodemography Center and distribute to studies. And this QR code actually would take you to our kind of exposome set of environmental data, which in the center we then link that through to all of these biological indicators. So first I want to present work from the full sample, and this work was actually funded through seed grant funding from Lori's CASH with the Center on Aging Context and Health. So this is work that Unyoung led. And this work really showed that there was an increased biological age associated with increasing temperatures. And we see that this starts to happen about when you would think that things start to feel kind of hot, which is starting around 80 degrees and moving up to 90 and 100. And there is no dose response here, but it is very clear that there's a big jump up from 80 to 90. And I should point out, though, that the heat index is a combination measure of temperature and humidity. So while you might think that 80 is kind of like a balmy, nice temperature, because it comes sometimes with this additional humidity, even at 80 degrees, and especially for aging people, evaporative cooling processes can be impacted. I also did not describe the biological age measure because I want to focus on the subcomponents, but if you're interested in how this measure is made, there's a citation here for that measure. But I'm more interested in the kind of subsystems and what's going on with specific biomarkers. And so we also analyzed the specific components of the biological age measure. And what we found was that people who were exposed to more heat had lower HbA1c, which is one of the main metabolic measures. They had a higher inflammatory burden, as shown with all of these different inflammatory markers. We also saw some impact on liver, which suggests that there's some liver-related stress, as well as impact on kidneys. So we're seeing evidence of that organ-related stress that other people have studied in clinical outcomes. And then we see some impacts on some of the blood cell markers. So that's just sort of setting the stage for what we see in the full sample. But what I'm interested in and going to talk about in this talk today is sex differences. Because if we're talking about the way that human bodies respond to heat in a population, then we have to really attend to the fact that men and women have different physiological responses to heat. And so if you come away with nothing from this photo, which is a little bit complex, it should only be that there are very few kind of inputs here on the left, which represent the different physiological pathways for men who experience heat to impact their biology, compared to much more complexity on the right, which are the pathways for women. But basically, men deal with heat by sweating, so that evaporative cooling is really important for them. Women, on the other hand, have more of this, what's called distributed vascular adaptation, this cutaneous heat response, which means that we don't sweat as much, but we throw off a lot of heat through our circulatory system. But women have all of these other issues to contend with, including that postmenopause, there's hormonal impacts on thermal regulation across the age range, but postmenopausal women, for instance, because of the loss of estrogen, have experienced most likely some endothelial changes, like the loss of collagen and elastin, which we think about in terms of wrinkles, but all of that loss of collagen and elastin is happening throughout our bodies as well, including in our vessels and our arteries, and so it impacts our circular system. Women also mount a very strong immune response, which has impacts on inflammatory load. I'm just going to skip that and go to the results. So we did the same exercise of looking at biological age against heat, but this time separated for men and women. And what you can see is that women seem to mount a response at pretty low temperatures, so starting at that 80 degrees Fahrenheit level. And again, we see a big jump getting from 80 to 90. Whereas men, we noticed when we disaggregated the results by gender, men only really seem to have a response at the highest temperature levels. So they seem kind of resilient until we hit extreme temperatures, whereas women have this early onset of vulnerability. We then disaggregated it again by the specific systems. And so that lower HbA1c that we saw in the full sample, that's only among men, not among women. And I'll explain why we see that in a minute. For the other systems, we saw that liver stress was really only being observed in women, and then a lot of that all these changes, these hematologic changes, are being observed in both men and women. So there's some clear sex differences that are emerging. And then the other major sex difference that we noted is that increased inflammatory load is really occurring among women, not so much among men. Okay, so doing this exercise helped us to understand a little bit more about how heat could relate to aging biology in the population. So I have here this, what I called the HbA1c paradox, because it was a little paradoxical to see that people, in this case, men who were exposed to higher heat would have lower HbA1c. We tend to think of lower HbA1c as a good thing and higher HbA1c as a bad thing, because the higher your HbA1c, the more likely you're going to be at risk for diabetes. But in this case, we saw that it lowered HbA1c, and we're not interpreting this to mean that heat is good for your diabetes risk. Instead, we think it's not showing signs of improved glucose control, but that in men, it's probably part of their response to dealing with heat. And so because men have much higher lean mass than women do, they have a lot more of their heat response isn't, they have a lot more of a metabolic component to it in terms of their insulin regulation in the body, because they have a lot more lean mass, which is involved with all of those systems. We also think it's interesting that we don't see that any of the cardiovascular markers are associated with heat, because actually cardiovascular outcomes, particularly like hospitalizations, heart attacks, dizziness, spells, those are the most studied and well-known population health correlates of heat exposure. But we think that what might be happening if we look at all of these biomarkers together is that there is a lot of cardiovascular load. But before we get to the outcomes associated with that, we start to see problems in other systems, including in kidney systems and maybe in like immune system, because those systems kind of don't have the resilience that the cardiovascular system does to deal with these environmental insults. And then the final takeaway for us for the sort of aging biology component of this is that we see this, what we think of as a conservation mode under thermal stress, so that the heat that we're experiencing is actually impacting our own energy balance within the body. And so it's having all of these knock-on effects on different markers. So to summarize those sex differences, though, so we found higher inflammatory markers in women. We saw one higher marker in men, which is this IL-6 marker, but there's not a lot of evidence that they mount a strong response resulting in inflammation. The fact that women are doing it is really consistent with a lot of other evidence on biological response to other environmental stressors. And then we saw this metabolic and renal impact in both men and women, although what's being impacted differs for men and women. And it seems to have a lot to do, again, with that sex-specific physiological response to heat. And then we also saw these hematological differences, which we think is really getting at things like women have lower plasma volume. And so the heat is then having impacts on their kind of blood volume. And then men, it's impacting some of their hematology because of other processes, like those metabolic processes that are involved in energy balance. So I've been the conclusions into kind of like the three boxes that I think are most important for us. The first is that although the focus of extreme weather has primarily been in looking at these acute health events or risks in the population, we could move a little bit further down that stream to think about like what are some of the upstream processes that might be happening. And the reason why this is important is because aging is not something that happens when people hit like their 60s, 70s, 80s, right? we're being impacted by the heat that we're experiencing in the places where we live in our 20s and our 30s and our 40s. It may not be manifesting as clinical outcomes, but we can see that there's some pretty clear evidence that there's some biological imprinting of those heat exposures. But importantly, those responses might be sex specific. And this is really important as we think about doing more of this research as population health researchers who may not necessarily be looking at clinical outcomes, but some of the outcomes we normally would look at. So looking at disability or cognitive functioning, that because men and women have these different responses to heat exposure, we need to think about doing sex specific modeling of those relationships. And then finally, several years ago, the National Institutes of Health made a big push and required focus on sex as a biological variable. And so this has been an impact from biological researchers up through our population research world. But we still don't see that much sex-specific analyses in environmental research. And so I think we need more of that. But I would say we need to incorporate sex not just as a biological variable, but as a social variable as well. And so that means thinking about weather exposures within a life course and a biodemographic framework, because of course you can think about extensions to this work, thinking about men's potential exposure to heat in occupational exposures. We can think about differences in health behaviors. So heat impacts might differ depending on if someone's a smoker or a drinker, which are behaviors that we know are sex specific. And then also where people live. We know that women tend to be more likely to live in maybe, neighborhoods that have certain health exposures because they have lower income in the population or lower SES. And so just thinking about as we try to make inroads into this area of research on weather or environmental exposures on health and aging in the population, to be focusing on sex here as a biological variable, but just sex generally, I think, in terms of both biological and social dimensions.
Great. That was fantastic. Thanks very much. Let's take maybe 2 questions for this paper, and then we'll open it up to Lori for a discussion section. Well, all right, I cannot resist asking. Do you think that women would do better in cold exposure than men would, given sort of the different physiologies and temperature processing capacity and differences in lean mass?
Yeah, I think women struggle with heat, and it was on one of the slides, but I didn't talk about it. Women have a lower, because they have smaller bodies, they have a lower surface to area ratio. And really what's happening is, if you all remember from your like high school biology courses, homeostasis is like always the objective. And our bodies actually have pretty narrow windows for most things, like temperature, right? If we exceed the temperature window in either direction by not even that many degrees, we die. We have organ systems failure and then we die. So we're constantly, all of our body is basically built to move heat from outside of our organ system and for sure away from our brain. And so for women, we do it from like circulation. And that's why women sometimes will feel like hot when a man doesn't, because he just has a greater surface to area ratio to dispel that heat. And then, because we're talking about aging, I think a lot about these, again, postmenopausal women. So as you go through menopause, thermal regulation is super out of whack. And then once you complete menopause and you've had that hormonal change of that estrogen drop, even your ability to kind of move heat away from the body is going to be impaired. So I don't think that means we need to move all women into a colder climate, but I do think it means when we're talking about like intervention strategies, we think about age-specific intervention strategies, but we might be thinking about some sex-specific differences too, that women are maybe going to have a harder time with heat than men are.
Great, thanks. Miyuki.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a question about like personal, like the adaptation of biological systems to exposure over time. So like, especially when you think about aging, is there an element of like, well, some like, I don't know, maybe men have been exposed more consistently throughout their lifetimes. So by the time they get to 60, 70, 80, they're reacting differently. Or I guess I don't know how quickly that like how quickly does your biological system react to repeated exposures?
So people ask about this like heat adaptation, and I think it's because they're thinking like, well, if heat's so bad, then how do people live in hot places? Which people live in hot places all over the world. I haven't seen a lot of evidence that people adapt to temperature in either direction. I know there's this idea that like if you live in cold areas, your blood gets thicker, I think is what people say. And I did 6 hard years in Michigan. But what I always told people was I don't think it was a biological adaptation. I think it was a psychological one. I just got used to the idea of feeling cold. And I've maintained that adaptation. On the other hand, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and suffered repeatedly throughout childhood and my teenage years with like sunstroke and like getting dizzy, throwing up, like it just, I think it's more like individual to individual changes. But how do people survive in Phoenix, Arizona? Well, you always have water with you. You try to stay in the shade. Like I think the adaptations are probably much more on the social side than they are on the biological side. And a lot of our biological adaptations happen like over generations, which could mean that like it is possible that maybe some places people have different evaporative abilities. But I think about like very humid places, a body that's well positioned for evaporative cooling that doesn't work in humid places is probably less likely to reproduce itself generationally. So like there is possibly some long-term adaptation that's happened over, I mean, however long humans have been living in these places. But the kind of short-term adaptation that we need to deal with how quickly our weather patterns are changing, I don't think that's quite how biology works.
Okay, question from James Collins, and then Lori will lead us into discussion.
This was really fascinating. Thank you. I have sort of a broad policy question, or what you think about the implications of your findings are for policy, particularly thinking about outdoor workers. And I'm somewhat aware of efforts to create a national standard for outdoor heat safety. I'm curious, like how you think about your findings, those developments, and sort of the implications of what you're finding for developing those kind of standards.
Yeah, so I think to focus on heat exposure for outdoor workers, which is kind of a relatively new focus, and it's only pretty recently that people are actually thinking about doing something about it. I think this kind of research is really relevant there because this really has implications for men who are working outdoors versus women who are working outdoors. And we have this issue with air pollution standards. The EPA bases all of its regulatory standards on a body of literature that is not focused on older adults or kids. It's mostly like healthy adults, right? So then we set standards, and it turns out at that standard, you and I are fine, but a 70-year-old is going to be at real health risk. I could see the same kind of thing happening for the efforts to deal with outdoor heat exposures, that if they're based sort of on a male physiological response to heat, then it could help them, but it may not be enough to help women who are out there because again, they're dealing with heat in a different way than men are.
Thank
Great,
you.
thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Lori Hunter from the University of Colorado Boulder is going to comment on the papers and lead us to some discussion topics.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I do have just one slide.
Okay, sounds good.
Oops, that's not it. Hmm. There we go. Just one slide. So sorry. Oh my, I'm working off my little screen and that never works very well. But we'll just do that. So thank you guys so much. And we're 15 minutes and I want to make sure that we've got time for the rest of the discussion. So the first section of this slide, we don't need to go over. It was just sort of the highlights of the different papers. And I just loved seeing them so much. And thanks all of you guys. They sent me their PowerPoints early, so I got to think about it. And then also while I was listening. So I'd like to take just this community perspective and get some thoughts on things like data and measurement, collaborations and mechanisms. So first off, data. So much interesting data here. So Ethan, I was thinking about Kinder. Where in the world did you learn about Kinder? And I just wonder how people find these different and amazing data sets, how they gain access to them. Are there ways that we can share what we have learned about all of this different data in order to just facilitate work beyond our own? So I'd love to hear those stories. Same with regard to measurement. So I know that Jennifer, you didn't go into it, but the idea of, how do we lag our exposures measures? And we've talked about this a lot in our community for years, but how can we learn from each other, share our measures, make sure that our studies can be comparable across space and across time to really sort of maximize our impact? So I'd love to hear about that too. Collaborations. I mean, so one thing, the first talk, I'd be curious if you've worked with any flood modelers or flood experts, because you made the point that flooding and flood movement is stochastic, and I don't know if water people would agree with you, right? That it's probably fairly predictable. And I also wondered, Jennifer, are you guys working with some folks that have that physiological expertise? Because there's just so much here. So I guess this is the community question. How do we find those people that we want to work with? Who is it that we need to work with to help us sort of interpret these things? And this does lead me to CASH, which Jennifer mentioned, but it's a center on aging. We're sort of climate has to come out of our name. We were the Center for Aging, Climate, and Health. So we are either the Center for Aging, Health, and Environment, or I liked your idea of context, Jennifer. But we are trying to do some of these kinds of things and be a place where we can share, point to different data sources, provide some code to help create different measures, and do the kinds of things that I mentioned would be useful for our community. So I'm hoping that if folks don't know about Cash, that you sort of click on or zoom in on that QR code and have a look, because we're working very hard to provide resources to do some of these kinds of things just to make sure that we can all do the best work we can, because this is also important. So I just love to hear contributions, community perspective, and all of that. So thanks, you guys.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Lori, and also Jennifer, Miyuki, and Ethan. That was terrific. Got a little bit of time left for a more general discussion or questions. So I hope you guys out there in the audience will speak up.
I mean, I can respond
Well,
to one of Lori's questions
sure.
about the time scale. I think that's a data issue.
Yeah.
So even thinking about, like Ethan said at the very beginning of his presentation, I don't think you would think of Houston as the most polluted place, but it's interesting to hear that it's the most polluted year round. And then you might think of some place that's not at all polluted, like Salt Lake City, Utah, that's extremely polluted when they experience these weather inversions. And so if your access to data is annual PM 2.5 or O2 or NO2 measures, that's not necessarily that helpful. It's masking a lot of temporal heterogeneity. So in our center, we work a lot on trying to develop so we have annual measures of PM 2.5, and we're just finishing a product, which is the number of days of high PM 2.5 and O2. And then in the work that I've done with Unyoung on heat, we've been using this prior 7-day exposure window, which tends to be a stronger exposure window. I still think it's interesting. Look at short term and look at long term. But having that kind of flexibility in the data is really helpful, especially when you're starting to move towards looking at health outcomes. So I mentioned that HbA1c measure, which HbA1c is a measure that's considered like a 3-month or 4-month snapshot of insulin regulation in the body, and we're using 7-day heat. And so like we're going to have to go back and look at some additional micro scale temporal measures of heat. I mean, we have reasons to think that the 7-day heat is still an okay exposure window, but I think this is a data issue that all of us are going to have to deal with, whether it's flooding or temperature or air pollution, that time scale, those lag windows. they have to be built on both conceptual rigor, but also just empirically available data.
That's what I was going to say. It's a data issue in terms of availability, but it's it's a substantive sort of issue, right? In terms of what is the appropriate definition. And I think, in the early days of this work, we would just slice and dice things in ways that were convenient. But I love the way you guys are all thinking about it really carefully and what is the right measure of exposure for the outcome of interest. That's fantastic and critically important if we want to get the right answers, right? Yeah. Thanks for all of your work. So, Ethan, this is just about data. I'm always amazed at how people come up with these really interesting data sets and data sources. And how did you find Kinder? And is it available? And are there other kinds of things out there that we should be using and somehow sharing information on these sort of unique opportunities?
Sure. So I worked at the Kinder Institute, which, I mean, Kinder Institute is a research institute funded by the billionaire oil magnate in Houston, which is interesting. But I worked there before I started my PhD for a year as a full-time RA on the survey. And so I worked on it in 2015, over a decade ago, and maintained that relationship. And then in 2022, when we had the chance to include our own module, Robert and I, who at the time was the director, collaborated together. So found out about it, I suppose, by happenstance, given my first job after college. And it is some certain survey years are available publicly through the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center. The Kinder Houston Area Survey is modeled after the Detroit Area Survey, which was a similar cross-sectional in Detroit that ended in the 2000s, but goes back to the 80s. And then restricted access data, which includes the zip code
Zip codes, right?
identifiers, are available through their website. I'll respond very quickly to George and Yu Young's question. Just to say that in our models that do include zip code, and again, this is average annual, like Jennifer said, average annual PM 2.5 ozone and NO2. So definitely masking a lot of local variation in peak days. That does not dampen the magnitude of the associations between race and health concern. So the models I showed you included the zip code fixed effects, which adjust for racial segregation in Houston. But even when we get rid of the fixed effects and instead control for local annual exposure to these pollutants over the year before folks responded to the survey, it doesn't explain the racial differences. So just a quick note on that. And we didn't do much more with the zip code level factors, just again, because that's not exactly what we saw as the advantage of using these data. Because we think there are other sources, other data sets that are more appropriate for answering that type of question and exploiting who moves to a new neighborhood and then their exposure or some natural experiment type stuff, which some of my other work is on.
Great. I mean, one of the things that always, has struck me for years now in work on extreme events and exposures in health is how important it is to sort of pull people from engineering and climate and those fields in, because they have this whole set of understandings about measurement that we really, as social scientists, mostly don't. And so I think that kind of collaboration has the potential to be incredibly important in moving the needle on what we know. Got a few more minutes. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, let's give a big round of applause, muted or unmuted, for our speakers. Thank you so much, everyone, for for being willing to put your presentations together and show up. Really appreciate it. And I hope we'll have Weathinar too one of these days.